At my daughter's 40th birthday dinner, 22 of us crowded into her new dining room, and I was 3 bites into my steak when my grandson tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Grandpa, don't sign anything. Not tonight. Not ever." 7 words. No context. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth, and I felt something cold move through my chest, because after 31 years running an insurance fraud unit, I know exactly what it sounds like when a 15-year-old boy has seen something he isn't supposed to understand yet, and understood it anyway. I kept smiling for the rest of the table, but some part of me, the part that never fully retired, was already awake and counting exits. Before I go any further, let me just say I'm grateful you're here tonight. Drop a comment and tell me what state you're joining from. I like knowing who's sitting with me for this one. And a quick note before we start. This story blends real experience with fictional details for the sake of the telling. Any resemblance to real people is coincidental, but I promise you the lesson at the end is not. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 68 years old, and for 31 years, I ran the Special Investigations Unit for a mid-sized insurance company outside Cincinnati, the department nobody wants to talk to at a party, the one that decides whether your claim is real or whether you burn down your own garage for the check. I retired 4 years ago, 3 months before my wife Carol died of the same slow illness that takes so many of the people you love the longest. Since then, I've lived alone in the house we bought in 1988 in a town called Loveland, Ohio, where the leaves turn orange along the Little Miami River every October, and I still can't drive past the hospital without my hands tightening on the wheel. My daughter Rachel is 39, going on 40 that night, a school teacher who married a contractor named Greg and had one son, Tyler, who was sitting beside me at that dinner table with his phone face down and his shoulders too tight for a 15-year-old at a birthday party. Rachel had remarried 2 years earlier after her first husband, Tyler's father, died in a car accident that still doesn't sit right with me in ways I've never said out loud. Her new husband, Mitchell Cole, stood at the head of the table that night in a blazer that fit a little too well, refilling wine glasses, laughing at exactly the right volume, being exactly the kind of charming that makes a room feel warm and makes an old fraud investigator feel a draft. I had shaken Mitchell's hand 11 months earlier, the first time Rachel brought him to Sunday dinner. His grip had been firm, practiced, the kind of handshake a man builds on purpose rather than the kind he's born with. I told myself I was being an old man who couldn't turn off the job. I told myself that 11 times over 11 months, every time Mitchell steered a conversation toward Rachel's late husband's life insurance payout, or asked with just the right amount of casual concern how the house was titled, or wondered aloud what a piece of riverfront property like mine must be worth these days. The dinner had been going beautifully until then. Rachel's toast had made half the table cry. She talked about turning 40 and finally feeling like she'd built a life worth having, about Tyler growing into a good man, about Mitchell showing up when she needed someone to show up. I watched my daughter's face while she said it, soft and open in a way I hadn't seen since before the accident, and my chest ached with something I didn't have a clean word for. Then everyone clapped, and the room loosened into that easy after-toast murmur, and I was reaching for my water glass when Tyler leaned into me. His voice dropped below the noise of the room, his eyes fixed forward on nothing, still wearing the polite half-smile of a kid at a family party. "Grandpa, don't sign anything. Not tonight, not ever." My hand went still around the glass. I did not turn my head. 31 years of watching people lie to my face for money had taught me exactly one skill worth keeping: how to take a hit and let nothing show. I used every bit of it right then. Tyler pulled back, picked up his fork, and became a bored teenager again in front of anyone watching. Nobody had noticed. Rachel was laughing at something Mitchell said. "Greg, no, wait, Greg wasn't there anymore," I reminded myself, feeling the old grief snag on the new one. It was Mitchell standing there now, pouring more wine, glancing my way with a smile that had never once, in 11 months, reached his eyes the way Rachel's first husband's had. I set my water glass down very carefully. I turned my head slowly, the way I used to sweep a suspicious claim site. Nothing frantic, nothing fixed, just wide open and absorbing. Mitchell was refilling glasses at the far end, laughing at his own joke, one hand resting a beat too long on the back of Rachel's chair, the gesture of a man staking a claim disguised as affection. I had looked at plenty of men like Mitchell Cole across a conference table in my career. Men who had learned exactly how far a smile could carry a lie. Something settled into the center of my chest, cold and familiar. The same feeling I used to trust walking into a house that had accidentally burned down 2 weeks after the owner increased his coverage. I excused myself to the bathroom and, once the door was shut, I called my old friend and former partner, Denny Fisher. He didn't pick up. I left a message, low and even. "Denny, it's Walt. Need you to call me back tonight. It's about Rachel." I hung up, stood in that unfamiliar bathroom in my daughter's new house for 10 seconds, breathing the way I used to before walking into a room where I wasn't sure what I'd find, and went back out to the party with my face arranged into something warm. I sat back down beside Tyler. "You okay, bud?" I asked quietly, not looking at him, watching the cake come out instead. "I'm fine," he said, too fast. "We'll talk," I said. "Not here." He nodded once, almost invisibly, and I felt the whole shape of the evening rearrange itself around a fact I now had to carry alone until I understood it. Someone in my family had made my grandson afraid enough to warn an old man not to sign his own name. The rest of that dinner is a blur of cake and candles, and Rachel blowing out 40 of them while Mitchell filmed on his phone with the practiced ease of a man who had learned exactly which angles flattered him best in a family video. I clapped when I was supposed to clap. I hugged my daughter and told her I was proud of her, and I meant every word. And underneath it, my mind was already running the tape backward through 11 months, looking for everything I had allowed myself to explain away. Mitchell Cole had come into Rachel's life 14 months after her husband Danny died. She'd met him, she said, at a grief support group at the community center, a place I'd actually encouraged her to go. God help me, because I thought she needed people who understood. Mitchell had lost a wife, he told everyone, 3 years earlier, to cancer. He was a financial consultant, vague enough about the specifics that I'd never once heard him name a single client. He was warm with Tyler in a way that seemed to matter to Rachel more than almost anything else. And Tyler had been polite to him, careful, the way a kid is careful with a stepfather he hasn't decided about yet. I remembered the first time Mitchell had visited the Loveland house, the one Carol and I bought when Rachel was 3 years old, the one that backed onto the river. He'd stood in the yard looking at the water, hands in his pockets, and said, "Man, this property must be worth a fortune now, this close to the river. You ever think about what happens to it someday?" He'd laughed like he was joking. I'd laughed too. I'd told myself he was just making conversation, the way people do. The way I used to tell nervous witnesses I was just curious before I asked the question that mattered. I had been telling myself that for 11 months. The party wound down around 9. I hugged Rachel goodbye at the door, and she held on a second longer than usual, the way she used to as a little girl when something was bothering her, and she didn't have the words yet. "You okay, Dad?" she asked. "Tired old man at a birthday party," I said, and smiled, and meant only half of it. Tyler walked me to my truck in the driveway, his hands jammed in his hoodie pockets, his breath fogging in the cold November air off the river. I unlocked the door, then turned to face him instead of getting in. "Talk to me," I said. "All of it." He looked back toward the house, where light spilled warm out of the windows and Mitchell's silhouette crossed behind the curtains. "2 weeks ago," Tyler said, his voice low and fast, like he'd been holding these words in a locked drawer. "Mitchell's laptop died at the kitchen table. He asked to borrow mine to check something real quick." I said sure. I wasn't even paying attention. I was doing homework at the other end of the table. He swallowed. But his email was already open on my browser from earlier, from when he'd used it before and I forgot to log him out. "What did you see?" "A message from some guy I don't know him. Some name I never heard before. Roy something talking about a trust restructuring and accelerating the timeline before year end." Tyler's jaw tightened, the exact same way Rachel's does when she's trying not to cry. There was an attachment, a spreadsheet. I opened it because I got scared, and I didn't know what else to do. My stomach dropped the way it used to right before a search warrant came back positive. What was in it? "Numbers, Grandpa. Your house, the river property. Some account with like $200,000 in it. Mom's name was on that one. And a column that said target signature Walter H., with a date next to it." His voice cracked on the last word. 3 weeks from now. I stood very still in that cold driveway with my hand still on the truck door. "Tell me the rest," I said. "From the beginning. Everything." Tyler told me the whole thing had a name attached to it in the file Cole-Higgins Consolidation, and that at the bottom, in a note, it said something about needing the old man's signature on the trust amendment before the holidays, while sentiment is high. He'd closed the laptop, he said, and gone into the bathroom and thrown up. Then he'd come back out and eaten dinner with Mitchell across the table like nothing had happened, because he didn't know who to tell, because he was 15 years old and terrified of being wrong about the man his mother loved. "You should have called me the second you saw it," I said, harder than I meant to. His eyes came up to mine, wet and furious. "I didn't know if you'd believe me. His mom loves him, Grandpa. What if I ruined everything over nothing?" Those words landed in my chest like a fist. I thought about every practice I'd missed when Rachel was young. Every late night at the office when Carol covered for me without ever making me feel it. Every time I'd told myself that providing was the same thing as being present. I had not been the kind of father, the kind of grandfather a kid calls first when the ground opens up. I put my hand on his shoulder and gripped it harder than I intended to. "You are not wrong," I said, "and you are not carrying this alone anymore." Tyler's face did something complicated then. Relief and grief tangled together, and he nodded hard, using the motion to shove something back down where it couldn't spill out in his mother's driveway. "We go back inside for 2 more minutes, I told him. "Say goodnight like normal, and then I need you to act exactly like tonight was just a birthday party. Can you do that?" "I've been doing it for 2 weeks, he said. "I know you have," I said. "You won't have to do it alone, starting now." We stood there another moment in the cold, the party noise faint behind the walls, and I thought about Carol, about how she used to tell me, near the end, lying in that hospital bed with more wisdom in her tired eyes than I'd earned in 30 years of detective work. "Walter, you spent your whole career reading liars. Don't you dare stop reading people now that you've got nothing else to do." I hadn't taken it seriously enough. That was the truth I'd been carrying since the day she died. "Grandpa," Tyler said as I opened the truck door, "what if he finds out I know?" I felt something old and steady settle back into my bones, the thing that had never failed me in 31 years. "Then we make sure," I said, "that we find out everything first." Denny Fisher called me back at 11:40 that night. I was sitting in my dark kitchen with 2 fingers of bourbon I wasn't drinking, the porch light on out back the way it had been every night since Carol died, because I couldn't stand coming home to a completely dark house. "Walt," Denny said, gravel-voiced, awake instantly the way cops and investigators always are. "What's wrong?" "I need a favor," I said. "Off the books. Tell me. I need you to run a name. Mitchell Cole. Says he's a financial consultant. Met my daughter at a grief group about 14 months ago." I paused. "And a second name, Roy. Last name unknown. Connected to something called a trust restructuring. This about Rachel's new husband?" "Yes." A longer pause. The sound of Denny sitting up in bed, 40 years of instinct kicking in before the conscious mind caught up. "How bad?" I looked at the framed photo on my kitchen counter, Carol in the garden the summer before her diagnosis, laughing at something out of frame, completely at peace with a life she didn't yet know was going to be cut short. "I don't know yet," I said. "That's why I'm calling you at midnight." Denny showed up at my back door at 7 the next morning in the same green Buick he'd been driving since he retired, parked at the same careless angle he always used. Muscle memory doing the parking before his brain caught up. I'd been awake since 5. Coffee made, kitchen table cleared. Every document I owned on the house and the river property spread out in front of me like evidence at a scene. He poured his own coffee without asking, the way he'd done in my kitchen for 30 years, and sat down across from me. "You slept maybe 2 hours, he said. 1, I said. "What did you find?" Denny slid a folded printout across the table. I looked at the photo in the corner, a man in his mid-40s, receding hairline, a face that had learned exactly how much to smile and exactly when to stop. "Mitchell Cole, 46, Denny said. "But that's not his birth name. Real name's Michael Colston. Worked 11 years as a claims adjuster for a firm in Columbus. Fired 6 years ago off the record, caught steering fraudulent claims through his own desk for a cut. They let him walk quietly instead of pressing charges, because the paperwork trail was messy enough that prosecution would have embarrassed the firm." My stomach tightened. A man who'd spent a career learning exactly how insurance investigators like me think, and exactly how to stay one step ahead of them. And the grief group story. Real group, real building, Denny said. But no record of a dead wife anywhere in Ohio, Kentucky, or Indiana under either name. No marriage license for a Mrs. Colston or Mrs. Cole who died of cancer. That part's fiction. I set the printout down. Outside, the first light was hitting the maple trees along the back fence, turning them gold. Carol had loved this exact hour. Coffee on the porch, the newspaper folded on the arm of her chair. I thought about the words Mitchell had used, standing in my yard, looking at the river. You ever think about what happens to it someday? And Roy? I asked. Denny pulled a second sheet from his jacket. Roy Nash, estate attorney, licensed but under disciplinary review by the Ohio Bar for 2 years, running irregularities in how he's drafted trust amendments for elderly clients. Nothing stuck yet. He and Colston go back 9 years. Business partners, more or less, though there's no paperwork that says so directly. How do they connect to Rachel's first husband's death? I asked, and my voice came out lower than I intended, because I'd been circling that question in my head since the day of Danny's funeral and never let myself land on it. Denny looked at me for a long moment. That's where it gets ugly, Walt. Danny Whitfield's accident report, single car, wet road, no other vehicle involved, ruled straightforward at the time. But 6 weeks before he died, Danny had increased his life insurance policy. $200,000 to $1 million. The agent who wrote that increase worked for a small independent firm. He tapped the paper. Owned by a silent partner, Roy Nash. The kitchen went very quiet. I thought about my son-in-law, a good, steady man who used to grill burgers in my backyard every 4th of July, who I had buried 3 years ago believing it was simply terrible luck. You're telling me, I said slowly, that Danny's death might not have been an accident. I'm telling you the paper trail is strange enough that it deserves someone looking at it properly, Denny said. I'm not going to tell you more than the evidence supports. But I've known you 30 years, Walt, and your gut's never been wrong when it feels like this. I sat back and pressed both palms flat on my kitchen table, the way I used to when a case cracked open in a direction I didn't want it to go. My hand's 68 years old, a scar along the left knuckle from a car door 40 years back, hands that had shaken Mitchell Cole's hand 11 months ago, while some old instinct screamed quietly underneath the pleasantries. He didn't just marry into money, I said. He might have made the opening first. That's what it looks like, Denny said. But Walt, if this is what I think it is, this isn't a con on your family. This might be a pattern. Nash and Colston don't strike me as men who found one target and stopped. Something cold and permanent moved into my chest, not panic. The particular stillness I used to feel the moment a fraud case stopped being about money and started being about how far someone was willing to go to get it. I need to know everything, I said. Every account, every document, every connection between them, going back as far as it goes. Denny nodded, stood, and gathered his printouts. At the back door he stopped and turned, his voice dropping to the register he used when something mattered beyond the job. Walt, how's the boy? The investigator fell away, and what was left was just an old man standing in his kitchen, trying to protect a family that had already lost too much. He carried it alone for 2 weeks, I said. 15 years old. Denny's jaw tightened. Kid's got more of you in him than you think, he said, and then he was gone. I called a woman named Patricia Boone that afternoon, an estate attorney I'd worked with for 20 years, the one who'd handled Carol's and my own trust documents. The one person outside Denny I trusted absolutely. Pat, I said, who outside this family has had access to my full estate documents in the last 2 years? A pause. Walt, why are you asking me that? Because I think someone's had eyes on my accounts for a long time, and I don't think it started with Mitchell Cole. I think it started before that. She was quiet for a moment. Give me until tomorrow morning. I need to check something. Patricia called back at 7:50 the next morning, her voice carrying the particular careful weight of a lawyer who'd found something she wished she hadn't. 3 years ago, she said, my firm brought on a paralegal temporary contract, filled in during a maternity leave. She had access to 11 client files that spring, including yours and Carol's full estate documentation. A breath. She left after 4 months. No notice. I assumed she'd taken a permanent position elsewhere. My chest tightened. Her name, Patricia said, was listed as Angela Reyes. You ran it? This morning. There's no Angela Reyes with those credentials in the state database. The paralegal certification she listed doesn't exist. The reference letter she used was from a firm that closed 8 years ago. Someone had placed a fake employee inside my own attorney's office 3 years before Danny even died. 3 years before Mitchell Cole ever walked into that grief support group and picked my daughter out of a room full of people carrying real loss. They didn't find Rachel by accident, I said out loud, more to myself than to Patricia. They built the whole thing on purpose. Years ago. Walt, Patricia said quietly, I am so sorry. I should have run more rigorous background checks. You're not responsible for what these men built, I said, but I need everything you can find. And Pat, I need a protective filing on the accounts tied to that trust amendment. Today. I'll have it drafted by end of day, she said. I drove to Rachel's house that evening, under a sky already going purple over the river, and found Tyler on the front porch waiting for me, the way he used to wait for Danny to come home from work, except now it was me he was waiting for, and that fact alone nearly broke something loose in my chest. We sat on the porch steps together, out of earshot of the house, and I told him what Denny and Patricia had found most of it, not all of it, not yet the part about his father, because a 15-year-old boy did not need that weight added to everything else he was carrying tonight. I told him about Roy Nash, about the fake paralegal, about the timeline the spreadsheet had listed. 3 weeks, Tyler said. That's what it said, before the holidays. We have less than that now, I said. We move faster than they think we can. Tyler looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed but steady in a way that reminded me so much of his mother at that age that it ached. What do you need me to do? Keep acting normal, I said. Go to school. Be polite to Mitchell. Can you do that? I've been doing it for 2 weeks already. I know, I said. I know you have. It won't be much longer. He nodded, and for a second his composure cracked, just a small fracture running from his jaw to his eyes. 2 weeks of fear finally finding a crack in the wall he'd built to hold it. I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I used to when he was small and scared of thunderstorms. The particular gesture that means I've got you in the language grandfathers speak when words aren't large enough. Grandpa, he said, muffled, what if Mom doesn't believe any of it? I didn't have a clean answer for that. I only knew that whatever came next, I wasn't going to let my daughter walk into a signature she didn't understand the weight of. I'll call you tonight, I said. Go inside. Eat dinner. Be a 15-year-old for a few more hours. I met Denny 2 days later at a diner on Loveland Madeira Road, the kind of place that had been serving the same coffee to the same regulars for 30 years and had no intention of changing. He had 2 coffees waiting, his notepad open, covered in his particular shorthand that nobody else on the old squad had ever learned to read. Roy Nash filed paperwork 4 days ago, Denny said, without preamble, creating a new revocable trust structure. Guess whose name is listed as trustee? Mitchell's, I said. Mitchell's, Denny confirmed. And guess whose signature the amendment requires to finalize the transfer of the river property and the $200,000 account into that trust? Mine. Yours. He tapped the notepad. There's a family dinner scheduled for Thanksgiving at Rachel's house, 12 days from now. I'd bet my pension that's the date they're circling. I drank my coffee without tasting it. They're going to ask me to sign it at Thanksgiving, in front of the whole family, where saying no in the moment would feel like ruining a holiday. That's exactly the kind of pressure a man like Nash builds on purpose, Denny said. Make refusal feel like the crime. I thought about every year Carol and I had hosted Thanksgiving in that same dining room before Rachel took over the tradition. About how much store my daughter set by these gatherings. About how easy it would be, surrounded by candles and cranberry sauce and a room full of people she loved, to sign something just to keep the peace. Patricia's filing, I said. Where does it stand? Goes through Monday, Denny said. Freezes the accounts named in the amendment pending review. If Nash tries to push the transfer through after that, the bank flags it automatically. And when they realize it's frozen, I said, they'll panic, and panicked men make calls to each other. That's the theory, Denny said. We need to be documenting when they do. I drove out to see Carol's sister, my sister-in-law Marion, that same week, not for information, but because I needed, for 1 hour, to sit with someone who had known my wife longer than I had, and say some of this out loud to a person who wasn't 15 years old or carrying a badge. Marion listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap the whole time, and when I finished she reached over and gripped my wrist. Carol always said that boy Danny was too good to have died the way he did, she said quietly. She never trusted the story either, Walter. She just never had proof. Something in me went very still. She said that? When? Right after the funeral. She called me crying, and not just grief crying, something else underneath it. She said, Marion, something about that road doesn't sit right, and I don't know what to do with that feeling. Marion's eyes filled. I told her she was just looking for someone to blame. I'm sorry now that I said that. I sat in Marion's kitchen with my hands flat on her table and felt something shift and reshape inside me, the particular grief of learning that the person you loved most had seen the truth before you did, and carried it alone because the people around her hadn't taken her seriously enough. I drove home that night and went to the small office off the back of the house, the room that used to be Carol's sewing room, and I sat with her photograph for a long time. You knew, I said to it, before any of us. Why didn't you push harder, Carol? I knew the answer, even as I asked it. Because I would have told her she was grieving too hard to think straight. Because I had spent 34 years trusting evidence over instinct, except when the instinct belonged to someone I should have trusted completely. Rachel called me the next morning, her voice carrying an edge I didn't like. Dad, Mitchell wants to talk to you about something at Thanksgiving. Some paperwork for the family, he says, to protect everyone long term. A pause. He seems nervous about asking you directly. Would you just hear him out? For me? My jaw tightened until I felt it in my back teeth. I'll hear him out, I said, because it was true, and because I needed her to believe nothing was wrong yet. Thank you, Dad, she said, relief evident in her voice. He really is trying, you know. He loves Tyler. He loves me. I closed my eyes and thought about Roy Nash's trust document sitting frozen in a bank's compliance queue, about a spreadsheet with my name and a date on it, about a 15-year-old boy throwing up in a bathroom because he didn't know how to tell his mother the truth. I know he seems like he does, I said carefully, and left it there, because I wasn't ready yet to be the one who broke her heart, and I needed to be certain before I did. Patricia's filing went through that Monday at 9 in the morning exactly as planned. By 11, Denny called. Movement, he said. Nash tried to access the account structure at 9:20, got the automated hold notice, made a call 4 minutes later to a number registered to Mitchell Cole's second cell phone, the one that isn't in Rachel's contacts. How long was the call? 6 minutes, Denny said. Long enough to plan a response. 2 days later, Denny called again, his voice carrying a different weight. Walt, Nash and Colston aren't just working Rachel. I pulled property and probate filings in 3 counties going back 9 years. There's a widow in Dayton, a retired schoolteacher in Middletown, a farmer's family outside Batavia, same pattern every time. Grief group or church connection, a warm relationship built over a year or more. A trust restructuring pushed right before a holiday or an anniversary. 2 of the 3 targets lost significant assets before anyone caught it. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair. How many people have they done this to? At least 4, including Rachel, Denny said. Maybe more I haven't found yet. I thought about the widow in Dayton, about the farmer's family, about people who had trusted a warm smile at exactly the moment they were most raw and most alone, and something moved through me that wasn't only anger anymore, it had widened into something closer to responsibility. We're not just protecting my family, I said slowly. We're stopping something that's still running. That's how I read it too, Denny said. I called a journalist I'd worked with years earlier during a large fraud case, a woman named Corinne Ashby who now freelanced for a regional paper, and told her everything I could without compromising Patricia's filing. She was quiet for a long moment on the phone. Mr. Higgins, she said finally, if this is even half of what you're describing, this isn't a family betrayal story. This is an organized pattern targeting grieving people across 3 counties. I want in on this, carefully, and I want it done right, which means we wait for the legal process, not a headline. That's exactly what I need, I said. Someone who won't move faster than the evidence. 9 days before Thanksgiving, I drove to Rachel's house alone, in the middle of the afternoon while Tyler was at school, and Mitchell was, according to Rachel, at a client meeting. I sat with my daughter at her kitchen table, the same kitchen where I'd handed her a bottle when she was 3 days old, and I told her everything. Patricia's filing, Denny's findings, Roy Nash's trust document with the date on it, the other families, Danny. I watched my daughter's face go through every stage of a thing, breaking apart disbelief first, sharp and immediate, her hands coming up like she could physically push the words back across the table. Then something colder, as pieces she'd noticed and dismissed over 11 months started rearranging themselves into a shape she couldn't unsee. Then, when I said Danny's name and the insurance policy and the 6 weeks before his accident, she made a sound I had never heard her make before. Not even at his funeral, something low and wounded that came from a place words hadn't reached yet. He wouldn't, she said, and then quieter, would he? I don't know yet, I said, and I meant it, because I wasn't going to hand my daughter a certainty the evidence hadn't earned. But I know enough to tell you that whatever happens Thanksgiving, you cannot sign anything Mitchell or Roy Nash puts in front of you or in front of me. She put her face in her hands, and I moved my chair around the table and put my arm around her the way I hadn't done since she was a little girl. And she cried the way I imagined she'd needed to cry for 2 years and hadn't let herself, because she'd been so afraid of losing another good thing that she'd talked herself out of every warning sign along the way. I understood that fear better than I wanted to. I had done the same thing for 11 months. Tyler knew, she said finally, lifting her head. He's known for 2 weeks, and he didn't tell me. He was scared you wouldn't believe him, I said, the same way I was scared to believe my own eyes for almost a year. Rachel wiped her face and looked at me, something steadying behind her eyes even through the wreckage. What do we do? We let Thanksgiving happen exactly the way they're expecting, I said. And when Mitchell asks me to sign, we're ready. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and clear over the Little Miami, frost silvering the grass along the riverbank, the maple trees bare and dark against a pale sky. I'd been up since 5, the way I had every difficult morning since Carol died, coffee going cold beside me while I went over every document one more time. Denny arrived at my house at 7, and Patricia joined by phone at 8, and Corinne Ashby, who'd been quietly working her own sources for a week, texted at 8:40 to say the county prosecutor's office had reviewed the file overnight and had 2 detectives prepared to be nearby, discreet, in case the day required them. Nash is going to bring the document to the house himself, Denny said, reading from a text. Confirmed 20 minutes ago. He wants it signed at the table in front of the family before dessert. Same playbook as the other 3. I drove to Rachel's at 11, and the house smelled like turkey and cinnamon the way it always had. And for one unbearable moment, I let myself simply be a grandfather walking into a warm kitchen on a holiday before the weight of everything else settled back onto my shoulders. Tyler met me at the door, and something in his face had changed since the birthday dinner, steadier now, less alone. You ready? He asked quietly. Are you? I asked back. I've been ready for 2 weeks, he said, and for the first time since the party, he almost smiled. Roy Nash arrived at 1:30, exactly as scheduled, carrying a leather folder and a smile calibrated for a family holiday, greeting Rachel warmly, shaking my hand with a grip I now understood completely for what it was. Mitchell hovered near him the entire meal, refilling glasses, laughing louder than the jokes deserved, and twice I caught him glancing at his watch in a way that had nothing to do with the turkey. Dessert came out at 2:15. Roy Nash cleared his throat in the particular way of a man about to perform something he'd rehearsed. Walter, he said warmly, before we all sink into a food coma, I wanted to take 5 minutes with everyone here, since family should be part of these conversations, to walk through a little estate planning update. Nothing complicated, just making sure everything's protected the way it should be, for Rachel, for Tyler, for the whole family's future. He opened the leather folder and slid a document across the table toward me, a pen resting neatly on top. The room went quiet the way rooms do, when everyone senses a shift they can't name yet. Rachel's hand found Tyler's under the table. I looked at the document without touching it, the trust amendment, the transfer language, the river property, the $200,000 account, all of it dressed up in careful legal language, designed to look like nothing more than responsible family planning. Before I look at this, I said, keeping my voice even, warm, a grandfather at a holiday table. I have a few questions, Roy. About a paralegal named Angela Reyes, who worked in my attorney's office 3 years ago, and about a widow in Dayton, and a farmer's family, outside Batavia. Roy Nash's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes went very still. I don't know what you're referring to, he said. I think you do, I said. I think you and Mitchell or Michael Colston, whichever name you're using with him this week, have been running this exact table conversation on grieving families for at least 9 years. I think you knew Danny Whitfield's insurance agent personally, 6 weeks before his car went off a wet road that everyone else assumed was simple bad luck. Rachel made a small sound beside me. Mitchell's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Walter, he started, standing, his chair scraping back. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this is— Sit down, Michael, I said, and I let 31 years of interview room authority into my voice for the first time all day, and he sat, because some instincts run deeper than the performance covering them. The account you're trying to move today has been frozen since Monday. There's a fraud filing with my attorney, a pattern report with the county prosecutor, and 2 detectives half a mile from this house right now. The front door opened before Mitchell could answer, and Denny came through it with 2 plainclothes officers behind him, and I watched Roy Nash's carefully built composure finally crack down the middle, watched Mitchell Cole's face empty out into something with no performance left in it at all, just a cornered man doing arithmetic he already knew the answer to. Rachel was crying, silently, her hand still locked around Tyler's, and I reached across the table and took her other hand, and I did not let go while the room filled with the sound of a family holiday collapsing into something true. They took Mitchell Cole and Roy Nash out of that dining room in handcuffs, past the turkey carcass and the half-eaten pumpkin pie, past the framed photographs on Rachel's wall, one of which was still Danny, laughing at some long-ago 4th of July, because Rachel had never taken it down, and I understood now, in a way I hadn't before, exactly why. The investigation that followed took months. The prosecutor's office, working from Denny's research and Patricia's filings and Corinne's careful reporting, connected Nash and Colston to 5 families across 3 counties, 3 of whom had lost significant money before anyone caught the pattern, and one Danny whose death was reopened for investigation on the strength of the insurance timeline alone. I won't tell you here how that part resolved, because some things a family carries privately even after the story becomes public, and I think that's right. What I'll tell you instead is what happened 3 weeks later, on a cold December evening, when Tyler and I sat together on the same porch steps where he'd first told me everything, hot chocolate steaming between us, the river dark and quiet beyond the yard. I keep thinking, Tyler said, that if I hadn't seen that email, none of this would have come out. And that scares me more than anything else did. You did the bravest thing I've ever seen from anyone in this family, I said, including me. It took me 11 months to trust what I already knew. It took you 2 weeks to say something out loud. Even though you were terrified, nobody would believe you. He looked at me, eyes bright in the porch light. I was so scared you'd think I was making it up, or that I'd ruin Mom's whole life over nothing. You didn't ruin anything, I said. You saved it. I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I had that first cold night. I'm not a perfect grandfather, Tyler. I missed things I shouldn't have missed. With your mother, with your grandmother, for years longer than I want to admit. But I promise you this, I am never again going to be too slow to believe the people who love me enough to warn me. He leaned his head against my shoulder, 15 years old and steady in a way that made something in my chest finally loosen after weeks of holding tight. Grandma would be proud of you, I said. She saw people better than anyone I ever knew, and she'd have seen you exactly the way I see you now. We sat there a long while, the cold coming up off the river, the porch light throwing our shadows long across the frosted grass, and I thought about Carol, about the message she'd tried to send me from beyond a hospital bed years before any of this began. Don't stop reading people just because you retired, and how it had taken losing her, and nearly losing my daughter's future, to finally understand that she hadn't only meant the strangers. I am not a young man anymore, and I've spent most of my life reading other people's lies for a living. But the hardest lesson I ever learned came from my own family, from a boy young enough to be my grandson who had the courage I didn't have at his age, the courage to say the true thing out loud, even when he was afraid of what it might cost him. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's simple. The people who love you are watching you more closely than you think. And sometimes, the people trying to warn you are the quietest ones in the room. Don't wait as long as I did to listen. Don't let a smile you can't quite trust talk you out of the instinct that's telling you something is wrong. And if someone you love, however young, however unsure of themselves, leans in close and tells you something urgent, believe them first and ask questions after. We very nearly lost everything that mattered because I spent 11 months explaining away a feeling I should have trusted from the first handshake. We got it back because a 15-year-old boy loved his family enough to risk being wrong. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear it. Tell me in the comments what part stayed with you. And if you've got someone in your life brave enough to warn you the way my grandson warned me, go tell them thank you today. Don't wait. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And I'll see you in the next story.